Why do you want to be controller?
It's an important position for the future of the city. The fiscal challenges we're facing are real. How we deploy our capital will determine whether we build the schools, the housing, the infrastructure we need to keep New York City what it has to be, which is a magnet for those folks who want to be creative and work hard and build the future. And ensuring that we put those pieces in place will require a lot of hard decisions. I think I can say to the public I've got skills that fit the job, having been an attorney general, dealing with fiscal issues on Wall Street, having been governor and put in place budgets that reflected the values I think voters appreciate in terms of investing, but also balancing tax burdens, et cetera. And it comes back to service. I've done many things in my life. Been a lawyer in the private sector, been a prosecutor, been attorney general, been governor, run a family business, been a TV host, written. All of those things are wonderful and exciting. Public service is what is most exciting, most rewarding. I want to contribute to the city and do things that I think make a difference.
Why specifically as controller?
The fiscal issues are very real as we go forward. And management of the pension, which is one piece, it's not the entirety of the job, but it's one piece of the job, requires an understanding of capital markets. It requires an understanding not only of what you can do if you manage those assets more effectively, but also how you can leverage that into improvements in our city. And what I say, and it sounds crass, but it's an accurate, sort of quick statement of what this is about, is money is power. And the money in those pension funds and the money in the state budget is the power that the citizens of this city have to effectuate our plans for the future. And I don't think we're doing that as effectively as we might.
And why would the residents of Northern Manhattan and the Bronx be best served by you as controller?
Well, take the issue of housing, schools, transportation. Those are three critical pieces that will determine our future. I lived up here in Riverdale, or in Riverdale. I happen to be close to it right now. And I know that one of the issues is, do we have enough housing stock? There's a growing population throughout the city. How can we build more affordable housing, maintain the serenity and beauty of Riverdale, for instance? But you go through the Bronx, you see housing popping up everywhere. How can you increase the housing stock in a good way and increase access down to the central business district? That means investing in our subways and bus lanes, in things that work. And that requires a smart allocation of resources and having the resources. And those are the things that if you manage the pension funds, manage the budget, you will do well.
Let's talk a little bit about the management of the funds. As controller, you assume responsibility for over $140 billion in assets. And after Newtown, you've written on how pension funds could be used for greater purposes like steering money and divesting away from certain industries. And you pointed specifically to Cerberus, who had been tied to the freedom.
They owned the company that produced the article.
Precisely. And you wrote that ownership has both responsibility and power. It is time for every controller and pension fund manager with an investment in Cerberus to use that power. What investments would you be looking to move away from that the city presently is invested in now, and which would you more aggressively pursue?
I'll give you two examples that are historical and that I think define the issue, and then I'll pivot to something which I think is the more important point about how we use this power. One is when I was in college, the issue of divestiture from companies that were doing business in South Africa. There is a clear moral mandate that we don't profit from companies that are invested in racist regimes, and that effort contributed to the successful change of the South African regime. And I think people look at the divestiture movement as a successful grassroots effort to use the power of the capital markets to change political decision making. And so that's one piece. Two is the gun case, where we don't want to profit from production of AR-15s that are being marketed in a way that is clearly violative of our sense of right and wrong. Now, and I called Tom DiNapoli that morning. I said, hey, Tom, I would bet that the New York State pension funds are investing in Cerberus. It's one of the biggest private equity funds out there. If you have any allocation in private equity, you probably do. Call them, tell them you just are not comfortable with this. And what things rippled through, because many other people were thinking the same way, obviously. But here's what I would say. Those are political/social judgments, which are important to make. One does not invest in a vacuum. You invest in a moral climate, in a moral framework that speaks to how you want to make money. So you do not make money on guns. You don't make money that they're being sold illegally. Look, I'm not, some marketing of guns, fine. Second Amendment is there. but not AR-15s where the companies are saying we don't believe in any gun control, we don't believe in any limitations on the size of magazines, etc. That you don't want to participate in. The more important, or equally important, I should say, use of the portfolio is to improve the quality of management of the companies we invest in. And here's why. We went over the abyss, into the abyss in 2008 because corporate America was being governed poorly. The financial services sector had taken a drug and believed its own rhetoric about self-regulation, about leverage ratios that were insane, risk management theories that were completely upside down. More active shareholder participation could have stopped them and should have stopped them. Where were the shareholders, the pension funds, the endowments, the mutual funds, over the years leading up to this? Some of us were saying, and I was doing it in a regulatory context, saying you're committing fraud. But fraud wasn't the only problem. A failure of judgment was the equally important problem. And shareholders have the obligation to participate in management. And when we fail to do that, we're letting the CEOs use our money to create a bubble that cost us $14 trillion. That's the cost of the crisis. That's the National Fed. The Fed said $14 trillion, 1 year of GDP. And that's what it costs us. So sure, we need to get better directors, better risk management, participate in the strategic decisions, say to the banks, here's what you should and should not do. That is nitty-gritty management, separate CEO and board chair positions, things that don't get headlines, but are much more important day to day in terms of preserving and improving the quality of management.
There's specific instances of investment now that you look at and you say, as controller, I would move proactively, aggressively to divest from that particular fund.
I don't want to pick an issue yet in terms of divestiture, but I can tell you in terms of the corporate governance issue, I would lead an effort to separate board chair and CEOs. I'd go back to Jamie Dimon and say, Jamie, look at the litany of regulatory issues you have had over the last 6 months, from London Whale to malfeasance in the energy markets, to LIBOR, on and on. Don't you think checks and balances works? As I said, we have checks and balances in the Constitution, even though we have George Washington as president, he may be brilliant, the national whatever. Checks and balances is a structure you put in place because you don't want one person to have too much power. That's what we need in corporate America.
And Jamie Dimon says, I appreciate that, but no, we're fine.
He says we're fine, to which I would then say, why have you paid over $8 billion in fines over the last 10 years? Or 2 years, 3 years. I mean, there's a study, I think that's the number, but clearly there's something wrong, and it continues to be wrong. So let's put in place a new system of governance.
To that
It's not just like to him. I said, look, I will agree you may be the best CEO out there, but that's not the point. The point is you still want a structure that cabins and contains and makes sure things will run properly.
Well, he does it, but
He doesn't. Well, that's why shareholders ultimately get to vote and say, we disagree with you. We own the company, not you. And that is why ownership, as I said, we own them, they don't own us. It has to drive this understanding.
to that point, if you were to be elected, you'd inherit a city that's projecting a budget gap of $2.2 billion in the fiscal year 2015. Fixed public sector benefit costs are growing at nearly 8% a year, and you've got public sector workers demanding attractive pay increases. And how would then Comptroller Spitzer be managing that? I mean, you were talking about some significant issues.
First point I'd make is, and I don't say this to dodge the question, I'll answer in a second, the mayor has to put the budget together. And I don't want anybody to think that I'm running for controller to be a surrogate mayor. I mean, the mayor, just when I was governor, it was my job to put together a budget, not Tom DiNapolis, who was the controller, who would ultimately determine whether it was in balance. So I think a mayor is going to have to do a lot of the decision-making about the piece there. The biggest variable there is the contract with our municipal workers.
And you'd be weighing in on that.
Absolutely, absolutely. But I think the mayor's going to have to figure out how much and how retroactive, et cetera. The answer to that is fairness. And I did this when I was governor. We negotiated, and that's why CSCA's endorsement. It's not that I gave them a whole lot, but they knew I was being fair to both them and the taxpayers. We balanced the state budget. We gave them an increase that was inflation plus a little bit. You're not going to ask people to take less than inflation because then you're asking them to take a pay cut. But you say inflation is the baseline. How much above that can we afford? Afford a little bit retroactively, more prospectively. And then that now exactly how much, how do you allocate it between contributions to pensions, contributions to healthcare, straight wages, lump sum payments that don't get built into the base so they don't compound in the future. Those are the variables that you play with to give people something that is fair. But I'd come back to a different point, which is perhaps slightly political, but I think relevant. The reason we have this issue is that we have had a mayor in a third term who did not want to confront tough issues. The reason we had the third term was because Scott, my opponent, and the political establishment got together and said, let's give him a third term because we don't want to run this cycle. There's a lot of the issues we have are third term issues that we shouldn't have had. Declining education performance, where a mayor did not respond appropriately to what the handwriting was there on the wall. Mm-hmm. Anybody who was in the education system understood that. The failure to generate contracts with employees was just a punt on his part. He said, I don't want to do it. I'll leave it for the next mayor, which gives us then a huge nut on the retroactive issue. So these are issues that should not have needed to confront a next mayor, but they do.
And we'll pivot back to that. I wanted your thoughts on the work of the present controller, John Liu.
You know, I think in some ways he's done a good job. I think he expanded the jurisdiction, something we haven't spoken about, the audit capacity of the office. And I don't mean the audit as in how many paper clips were delivered. That matters. And you've got to make sure there's compliance with contracts.
Or safe flooring levels in pools.
Right, right, but also at a policy level. I mean, the audits are done at many different levels. There's a level at which audits should be done to ask the question, what is working and what isn't working? Because when you have a budget of $70 billion and you're spending huge sums of money in education, healthcare, infrastructure, somebody has got to go back and look and say, does it work? Because the way budgeting unfortunately works is that year after year, once you're at 10, you go to 11, 12, 13. That's the sort of inertia of nature. Instead of somebody saying, wait a minute, we just put 10 in, are we getting value for that 10? And if the answer is no, then you can save that 10, put it into something that is working. So we need to do that sort of analytical work, and John began that. He also did, he and Mike together, proposing that we collapse the 5 pension funds to 1, save $400 million in fees. There's an inverse correlation between the fees you pay and the return you get. Not as a matter of physics, but just the way it happens to play out. And so we need to do better in that regard. And that is something I would very much like to do, change the management structure of the pension funds in order to get a better return over the time horizon.